Another 7 Russian combat aircraft have gone up in smoke in the last 2 days. Ukraine says this is to celebrate its Constitution Day, and there's nothing better than celebrating freedom by smoking a dictator's toys. But is this part of a larger Ukrainian strategy that's finally starting to deal real damage on the Russian economy? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to break all of this down. So this, I thought, was a crazy story because it's another example of, despite the fact that Ukraine staged a spectacular attack against Russian combat aircraft, the Russians haven't seemed to be able to respond meaningfully. Ukrainian drones have now reportedly struck 4 fighter jets inside of Russia. This is reportedly 4 Su-34 fighter jets at the Marinkova airfield. Let's see if we can get some a couple of stats and a location here. Right, the Marinkova airfield is reportedly pretty deep in Russia. Here we go. So here is Marinkova, and you can see that it is well beyond Donetsk Oblast and deep inside Russia. And crucially, this is probably a point at which these fighters are launching the notorious glide bombs and FABs and CABs. These are air-launched ground warheads that contain hundreds of kilograms of explosives. The Ukrainians on the front have said that the CAB and FAB bombs are some of Russia's most devastating weapons because while they are not as accurate as a true smart weapon, they're sort of like, they're like the smart weapon we have at home, right? You know, like the old meme, Mom, can we have a JDAM? And Putin goes, no, we have JDAMs at home. These are the JDAMs they have at home. But they pack a serious punch. And so taking out the launch vehicles, particularly something as difficult to replace as an Su-34, right, is really pretty tough on the Russian military. Because again, when you're looking at a relatively modern aircraft. These are aircraft that were introduced in 2014, though they first flew nearly 35 years ago. They still weren't able to be manufactured until fairly recently. Again, this is a function of the fact that the Russia is great at designing weapons. They can design weapons as well as anybody. The problem is they struggle to manufacture them, and that's in peacetime. So you can imagine that now that they're subject to vicious sanctions, building more Su-34s is pretty tough to do, right? In fact, they only have 156 of them. So literally taking out 4 of them represents like what, 2-3% of the total to ever exist. And it's also pretty expensive. Let's see if we can find an actual price here. But the Su-34s probably are costing, right, something in the range. Oh, yeah, thanks, AI. According around $85 million, or at least $36 million. But you can imagine if you're talking about them being taken out by even a $100,000 drone, which is unbelievably expensive in terms of the realm of drones, that's still 360 times the cost of that drone. So this is a classic example of waging effectively economic war on the Russian military. Now, according to preliminary data, 2 of the fighter jets were destroyed, another 2 were damaged. But what's worth pointing out is that, it doesn't take much damage. And this is actually a discussion around, for example, Iran's centrifuges, where a lot of individuals, commentators are debating how much damage can you do when you damage but don't destroy ultra sensitive, highly sophisticated, hard to replace equipment, right? Because even if the centrifuges appear intact, just like even if the Su-34 airframe appears intact, it doesn't mean that the avionics aren't damaged, that calibration of sensitive radar systems hasn't been damaged. And then the question is not, can they be restored? Can they be repaired? Can they be repaired with the parts that Russia currently has? And so that answer may be that these flights are inoperable until they can get their hands on sophisticated avionics materials, parts. So it's possible that all 4 could have been put fully out of commission, or even 3 of the 4, for example, maybe they have to cannibalize parts, right? Take the sort of reassemble a Frankenplane from the parts that haven't been damaged of each other plane. So, of course, they point out that this isn't the only strike. In fact, Ukraine's SBU also took out 3 Russian combat rotary wing aircraft in Crimea. This is reportedly, let's see if we can find it, 3 Russian helicopters, Mi-8, Mi-26, and Mi-28, and a Pantsir S-1 anti-aircraft missile were destroyed. Damage was inflicted by, you guessed it, air defense systems by unmanned aircraft, right? And they have some video of the operation that I probably can't show you because YouTube is YouTube. But what's, I think, quintessential is the fact that despite knowing full well that the Ukrainian military is targeting their most expensive assets, their most expensive enablers, the Russian military is still unable to stop them. And this is troubling because it shows that the Russian military, despite identifying a threat, despite understanding how to protect from the threat, is still unable to, right? They understand that the threat against these installations is unmanned drones. And the countermeasure is, well, drone jamming and anti-aircraft systems. But despite having the knowledge to stop them and the recognition of the threat, the Russian military is unable to actually marshal the resources to protect their airfields. Again, these are airfields that, as we just saw, are holding $100 million worth of aircraft that are irreplaceable by the Russian military. And still, they are unable to do so, right? And you looked at the attack on the Crimean Peninsula, where the Russian military had deployed what they thought was the correct system, a Pantsir air defense system. But once that was taken out, it was free game. There was no defense in depth to the Russian air defense plan. It was one Pantsir all in. And so I think this is a sign. I don't think I will actually roll out the evidence to you in this video that the Russian military is in way worse financial straits than anyone expected, right? Including even Vladimir Putin himself, I think, is starting to admit a version of, we can't keep this up, which is wild because it actually seems like the Ukrainians are better able to financially maintain this war. And before we talk about exactly how, I want to mention a few things. First off, I referenced earlier that there is almost no footage of combat that I can show on YouTube. And I'm not exactly sure on why that is. YouTube has tightened more and more its restrictions on combat that you can show or military operations. But one of the things that I believe is that we should all have an understanding of what is actually going on in the world. You can't have a sanitized version of reality, right? When we live in democracies, voters need to know what's up. So if you're interested in getting access to the uncensored, straight from the front lines combat footage, including Thursday's video that I dropped over on Combat Vet News, which was exclusive footage sent to me by units on the front lines, you want to become a member, right? Just go over to combatvetnews.com, click become a member, and become part of the elite crew that support me and this channel, enabling me to do this every single day, right? We're a small team. We're not a huge production. This beautiful studio is actually my garage. I can't park my cars here anymore, right? But the reason I can be an independent creator and not have to work for a major media outlet is because you guys have my back. And that means nobody tells me what I can and can't say. So, of course, as a reward, you guys get the uncensored combat footage. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we do a deep dive as to the actual state, the tactical, nitty-gritty details of how fighting is actually happening in battlefields across the world. Including a lot of Ukraine, obviously, but also places like Gaza, places like Iran, places like even Syria, all of which are valuable to understand how the world is changing and evolving, right? So thanks to all you guys that do support me. Link is in the description, but also a bigger thank you on behalf of the 59th Brigade, because as you guys know, when Ukrainian units are desperate for help, they reach out to us, right? You might know that UAO also recently partnered with Preston Stewart to do a fundraiser. And, they said, listen, Preston, he's a good guy. His audience is great, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys are big fans of him. And he raised, I think, 70 grand for that unit. But the fact is that these fiber optic drones are dealing real damage to these Ukrainian units. And they said, listen, we need whose audience, what community is going to be able to step up and help us against these threats. And they were like, listen, the guys at Combat Vet Reacts, they always step up for us. And as you can see, we're making good on it, right? We've already raised almost $30,000 to stop Russian fiber optic drones dead in their tracks. That includes everything from long-range reconnaissance drones to allow the Ukrainians to find Russian fiber optic teams, to collimators on and red dots for the shotguns meant to shoot down approaching at fiber optic drones, improved mobility, and most importantly, cover nets to allow these units to enclose and protect their key major supply routes. So if you're interested, if you're able to, you should absolutely make a donation, right? Up to $250 gets you a 59th Brigade patch, a thank you from the brigade for literally saving their lives, and of course, a bunch of other bonuses. A huge thank you to so many of you guys stepped up in a huge way. I mean, check it out. Somebody here dropped $1,000 donation. Dude, thank you so much. Again, and this is just what's public. You see $400, $250, even guys who are saying, listen, I'm out here. This is what I would have spent on ordering dinner, right? I whipped up some dinner at home and sent this to you guys. So a huge thank you to those of you that have donated. And if you're interested to see where your donations go, literally the Ukraine Aid Ops YouTube channel posts every single donation, every single drop that they do, obviously with a little bit of a delay, thanks to, ensure operational security. But you get to literally see the actual units they're going to, the actual supplies, the actual gear, and the difference that it's making for these units. So check all that out. The link to all that's in the description. And listen, it's actually really making the Russians seethe. You can sleep well at night knowing that literally Vladimir Putin seethes with rage, knowing that the Ukrainians appear to be having a better war economy, are better able to sustain the fight than Russia itself. Look at this. This is Putin himself coming out and saying something that literally just yesterday, right? We covered a video that said that the Russian economic minister is saying, listen, the Russian economy might actually go into recession. And Vladimir Putin is saying, well, yeah, actually, guys, we are going to have to cut military spending. This is crazy. Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that the war is going on, he's saying we're going to cut spending. He says we're going to reduce spending next year and the year after that over the next 3-year period. Whoa. Now, I want to point out that there are a ton of trolls in the comments who are like, this is fake news. The Russians, you've been saying the Russian economy is in trouble for 2 years. It's like, yeah, and it looks like the Russian economy has been in trouble for 2 years because now Vladimir Putin is validating everything. So again, co-parter Russian trolls, because he's admitting we have to, in order to not crash our economy, Russia has to start winding down its defense spending in the next 12 months and then has to continue to wind down over 3 years. And the fact is that even in an economy like Russia's particularly, basically growth, there's a bunch of fake economic growth driven by war spending. And you can get away with big spending to navigate a crisis. Think the COVID crisis, right? The reason the US economy didn't collapse, why millions and millions of citizens were not plunged into poverty from which they can't escape, right? And homelessness is because the government spent a bunch of money covering people's rents, sending out checks so people could buy groceries and afford medical bills. And all of that was able to sort of give the economy the extra boost it needed. Think of it like a little bit like an aircraft, right? If an aircraft can lose power right? It'll lose its engines. For a little bit, it can kind of glide. And if you can find a way to give it a little extra push, it can glide for just a little longer, buy you more time to get those engines turned back on. Well, that's the idea of Putin's war economy, is that it's drained fuel out of the real Russian economy. And the Russians are sort of able to coast along because the draining of fuel and burning it in the form of big payments to Russian families of soldiers who are killed and big payments to Russian defense manufacturers, those can kind of allow the Russian economy to keep going, to keep gliding, despite the fact that their real economy is collapsed. But that only buys you a little bit of time to sort of turn the real economy back on. Well, Russia is apparently running out of time. And the country, as they say, is facing a labor shortage. Private industries are absolutely cash-strapped, unable to get loans, unable to repay the loans they've already taken out. Even Russian soldiers who the Russian government has explicitly said, listen, if you come back from war, you could jump to the front of the line for government jobs. Even hundreds of thousands of them are totally unemployed. And the fact that Putin is literally admitting, not only do we have to slow down this defense spending, we have to pivot this economy away from a defense economy or else it's going to collapse. But even worse, that they already appear to be doing so, because despite the Russian military having massive recruitment needs, right? The Russian military continues to have extremely high recruitment needs. It continues to have extremely high inflation. It's still winding back bonuses in at least some of their key states, right? In fact, starting 20 days ago, one territory in Russia, Bashkortostan, is dropping its one-time payment down to just $12,000, down from $20,000 earlier, nearly cutting it in half, right? Of course, this payment comes from a fairly large number of folks from both the Russian federal government and the state government, but it's not really a meaningful distinction because, again, this is like separation of powers in a dictatorship is just paperwork. And the fact is that there's a lot of stories that we've heard, including some leaked sources who have asked me not to share publicly what they found, but they've provided me some pretty credible evidence that the Russians are just not paying these bonuses. And a lot of these recruits are actually getting coerced to sign with the expectation these bonuses are never going to be paid. So the fact that they're winding these bonuses back could mean that there's a lot more Russians. Suddenly, Russians have found hundreds of men, thousands of men willing to sign up and fight and die. But it seems more likely that they simply cannot afford to continue to pay bonuses out in this way. What's interesting too, though, is that there appears to be a growing personnel crisis, because if Russia was awash, for example, in recruits and didn't need to make serious recruitment efforts, why would North Korea be strong-armed into deploying 20% of Kim's elite personal reserve, right? And as the Ukrainian Minister of Defense points out, the 20% of Kim Jong-un's elite personal reserve force has been deployed. He adds these are soldiers selected based on what they say are physical, psychological, and other criteria, i.e., they have to be physically fit and of unquestioning loyalty to the regime. 0% chance that they will stage a coup. He says all the other units have suffered significant losses. He also dropped an unusual statement, which is that there have been 4 rotations of North Korean units deployed against Ukraine, meaning that the attrition rate might be even higher than is publicly known. But here's the thing. North Korea is bearing a huge military burden. Umarov alleges that Russia has not upheld its reciprocal obligations, though it's unclear if that's actually the case. But the fact is that the North Koreans are likely unwilling or nervous about sending a large portion of their military to fight in Ukraine because there's a reason why Kim has a personal, extremely loyal core of the military, and they exist primarily in these kind of regimes, that core military group exists to actually be insulation against a coup, right? The idea is when you have your personal Praetorian Guard, that these highly loyal folks are going to literally shoot even other members of the military. For example, if a North Korean general decides that, hey, we've spent enough of our money and enough of our lives fighting in Kursk, it's time for me to replace Kim with myself, that guard is going to be willing to shoot that general's troops and that general if necessary. And so the fact that even some of those loyal troops are being farmed out to fight in Kursk or fight in Ukraine is a really, really troubling sign. And generally, you're not going to have the North Koreans get asked to do that by Russia unless the need is pretty great, right? We also point out that the North Koreans are also being asked to provide 25,000 laborers to Russia to support drone production. And again, this is not the action of a Russian military who is awash in troops, who can afford to pay their laborers. Because notably, FYI, I don't know if you knew this about North Korea, you don't get a choice in North Korea if you become a laborer. In fact, the pay that these laborers receive is basically zero. Your reward is not having your family gulagged. And so for Russia, this is an indication that both their need for combat troops and non-combat labor is really high, but their ability to afford it is falling off a cliff, right? So taking this together, you end up with a pretty clear situation that the Russian military war machine, particularly its ability to generate, meat for the meat grinder, the blood for the blood god, so to speak, is actually very, very limited and in a real crisis. It's not just a theoretical economic crisis. In fact, President Trump, I want to be clear. This is somebody who just says stuff. And we shouldn't put much credibility in what he says, right? It's literally just a random event if what he says is absolutely correct or absolutely fiction. But sometimes he drops things that I think are truths that a president is not supposed to leak, right? What he said is, Trump said, quote, "I know one thing. He would like to settle. He would like to get out of this. It's a mess for him. I said, you can help me get a settlement with you." He said, "I think we're going to be doing that soon." This is really interesting because, again, Putin strings Trump along all the time. Trump misinterprets things all the time. But it seems kind of weird, right, for Trump to say he definitely would like to settle. And maybe that's the reason why Putin has made all of these additional frequent calls to Trump to say, listen, I think maybe I need to get out of this one. I think maybe things are a lot worse than I thought. And that Trump is probably my best lever to try to get some kind of concessions from the Ukrainians before I literally run out of human beings to throw at this. Anyway, guys, thanks to the Colonel tier members, all those folks like James, J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Rand, TR Need, Alan Lutz, and CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. Again, you guys are the ones who make this whole thing sustainable and possible for me. I thank you so much. I hope you guys really enjoyed that footage that we looked at earlier of the infiltration into Touretsk. It was really informative, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.